Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Dam Busters, the RAF Bomber Command podcast with me, James Jeffries, and my co-host, Jane Gulliford-Lowes. This week, we have what we're sure will be a brilliant and very thought-provoking discussion with former US cavalry officer turned academic, associate professor, and Holocaust historian, Dr. Waitman Beorn. Welcome to the show, Waitman.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Hi, Waitman. It's really great to have you on the show. For those of you not familiar with Waitman's work, as well as being the host of an excellent podcast on the history and historiography of the Holocaust, Waitman is the author of several books on the subject. I'd especially like to mention his book Marching into Darkness, the Wehrmacht and the Holocaust in Belarus, which was published back in 2014, I think, but remains one of the best books on the subject that I've ever read. I can't tell you the impact that this book had on me when I read it. It just kind of really stayed with me for ages, and I just kept turning it over and over in my mind all the time. So it highly, highly recommended. And also, Waitman's got some new work on the Janovska camp as well. Now, Waitman, we've invited you onto the show today to discuss perhaps one of the thorniest, most difficult, and probably most sensitive topics that we've dealt with so far on this podcast. The question of whether the Allies could and should have bombed Auschwitz-Birkenau, and indeed any of the other extermination and concentration and labour camps. So I think there are two questions really at the heart of this debate that we're going to be looking into. The first is, what did the Allies know about the camps and when? And the second, was bombing Auschwitz a realistic possibility from a technological air power point of view? Now, there's been an awful lot written on this subject, and both academic and popular opinion has vacillated between different positions. But it appears that as early as 4th of January 1941, a brief report from the Poles on the camp at Auschwitz, as it was then known, was sent directly to Air Marshal Sir Richard Pearse, then head of RAF Bomber Command. Pearse passed it on to Sir Charles Portal, head of the Air Staff, offering to use a small force of Wellingtons. Portal gave his response just 4 days later. Pearse then reported back to General Sikorsky, telling him that an attack on the camp was not a practical proposition. He said that first, British bomber forces were fully committed to the attack on Germany's industrial resources, an attack that he speculated was likely to precipitate a crisis in Germany's war economy that very year. As we now know, that was a wildly over-optimistic assessment, given the well-documented issues with RAF bombing and accuracy at that particular time. But this required Bomber Command to use every opportunity to strike vital targets, and he pointed out that the weather conditions which would enable the RAF to attack targets in Poland were just those which would allow it to engage its major targets in Germany. He also argued that an attack on camp was unlikely to achieve the hoped-for result, namely the escape of prisoners, made possible by the destruction of the camp's barbed wire fences and nearby ammunition dumps. He continued, air bombardment of this nature would need to be extremely accurate if serious casualties were not to be caused among the prisoners themselves. Such accuracy cannot be guaranteed. I am so sorry to have to give you this answer, but I know you will appreciate the reasons, and the fact that only by rigid concentration of our bomber forces on the main objectives are we likely to be effective against our common enemy. Now, Professor Tammy Davis-Biddle, I know some of you will be familiar with her groundbreaking book, Rhetoric and Reality in Air Warfare. She commented that this exchange was notable because it represented a very early request to bomb Auschwitz. Also, that Pearse revealed a basic willingness to do so, and that the language, or excuse if you want to call it that, the Portal used was very similar to that used when the same request to bomb Auschwitz put forward in the summer of 1944. I wondered what your thoughts were on this, Waitman. Perhaps you can begin by describing what Auschwitz looked like in early 41 and describe its expansion and development over the sort of period that we're looking at.
Yeah, sure. And this actually it's a really interesting time to even contemplate the idea of bombing Auschwitz. And so the Auschwitz camp, as we'll talk about, is really three separate camps. It is Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II Birkenau, and then Auschwitz III Monowitz, which is the factory slave labor camp. In the time that this request was made in early 1941, the only camp that exists really is Auschwitz I, and this consists of predominantly a series of brick barracks that were used by a Polish army unit prior to to the invasion of Poland in 1939 by the Nazis. So there's no large gas chamber apparatuses. In fact, there's no mass killing taking place at the camp at this point in its existence. And I can go through really quickly to get us up to sort of when we have actual, genocidal extermination systems in place, right? So in early 1941, the time that we're talking about here, the prisoner population is predominantly Poles. There are Jews that are there, but they're usually there where their Jewishness is secondary to the reason that they're there. So they're there as political prisoners or whatnot and happen to be Jewish. There are no gas chambers in January of 1941. These come about a little bit later in the year after the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. So the first people that are gassed are Soviet POWs that are gassed in the basement of Block 11, and then later on in a converted ammunition bunker / morgue in Auschwitz I, known as Crematorium 1. And that's the gas chamber that's in operation off and on until two other buildings began gassing Jews, predominantly Jews, in March 1942. And those are the Little Red House and the Little White House, or Bunker 1 and Bunker 2. And those are around the area of where the camp called Birkenau is going to be created. And Birkenau is first mentioned by Himmler in March of 1941, but really comes into fruition after the invasion of the Soviet Union, where now Himmler envisions a camp for 100,000 laborers. And so the planning for Birkenau doesn't even begin until October 1941. Construction begins later on, and work doesn't begin on the crematoriums / gas chambers in Auschwitz to Birkenau until August 1942. And actual gassing doesn't take place there until March 1943. And so all I'm trying to lay out here is that in a time period where that request is made, the gassing apparatuses that are going to be requested to be bombed in 1944 don't exist at that moment. They are built much later in Birkenau. So there's really nothing really to bomb for all intents and purposes in 1941. In addition, something that's going to be important, construction begins in May 1942 for the Bühnewerks, or what becomes known as Auschwitz III Monowitz, which is a large factory complex a couple miles away from the other two complexes. And so that's kind of the general development of the camp. It begins as essentially a prison camp for political prisoners that the Nazis are trying to oppress / lock up. Auschwitz I also houses the sort of Gestapo office that does some of those things as well. Then we have Auschwitz II Birkenau, which initially is intended to hold 100,000 Soviet POWs, but as the condition of POWs is so terrible, and later on POWs are directed to the war effort, it becomes a place predominantly for holding thousands and thousands of Jewish prisoners. And then we have Monowitz, which is the factory labor camp.
I'd like first to go back to an article by David S. Waitman entitled "Why Auschwitz Was Never Bombed" in the journal Commentary in 1978. And Waitman argued that the gas chamber and crematoria at Auschwitz and the railway lines that led there could and should have been attacked by Allied bombers in the summer and autumn of 1944. Waitman, can you tell us a little about how this article was received at the time and how the debate unfolded? I'm thinking particularly about Neufield's book, The Bombing of Auschwitz, which is an edited collection of essays by academics and historians in various related disciplines on the topic.
Yeah, I think, you were correct when you started out the podcast by saying this is a sort of thorny issue. And I think it's a thorny issue because, in my view, the decisions to bomb Auschwitz or not to bomb Auschwitz really are kind of a litmus test for what one's take on Allied response to the Holocaust is in general. In other words, they kind of stand in for a much larger debate about, what the Allies could have done, should have done to, prevent the Holocaust, end the Holocaust, rescue Jews, et cetera, et cetera. Because by the time we're going to be talking about, the greatest bombing effort in the world is really not going to save very many people. For all intents and purposes, in the larger context, of the war, right? I mean, you could have a cruise missile strike, and it would save a number of people. But by the point in which it's being used, the vast majority of the victims of the Holocaust have already been killed. And so, really, what you get is arguments that sort of run the spectrum, from America could not have done a single thing better to help the Jews, which is the argument of a guy named Rubenstein, who writes a really terrible book called The Myth of Rescue, in which he basically argues there's nothing the United States could have done any more than it did to help rescue Jews. On the other hand, you have some more extreme people like Waitman, but also Raphael Madoff, who really, really take America to task as sort of saying, it was an anti-Semitic government that didn't care about Jews at all and didn't do anything to help them when it really could have done a lot. And, the historiographical sort of response is always someplace in between. And so, these scholars are looking at one particular instance. And on the one hand, it can seem sort of very technical and straightforward, but I would suggest that also there's a lot going on behind the scenes. It's doing a lot of work that plays into a much larger debate, which is sort of the Allies and predominantly America's response to the Holocaust and attempts to sort of end it, delay it, and rescue people, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And touching on the first question is one of the first two questions at the beginning. What did the Allies know and when?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, you guys just have like these really easy questions. I mean, this is quite a difficult one. It often depends on who do you, even amongst the Allies, who do you mean when you say the Allies know? I think a good place to start is really actually in World War One, because one of the things that happens in World War One that creates a big challenge for at least the initial understanding of the Holocaust is the atrocity propaganda. Out of World War One, sorry, I'm in Britain, the First World War. Out of the First World War, there is a large amount of atrocity propaganda, much of which is sort of overblown. Germans doing horrible things to women and children, and I mean they did. I mean there were lots of people there were several thousand that were murdered, but the scale of the atrocity, which ended up not being borne out by the facts, provides at least the initial background for a lot of the stories coming out of occupied Germany and occupied Europe, which means that some people are legitimately questioning whether these stories are accurate, and others are able to use the experience of the First World War, perhaps maybe disingenuously, to suggest that these are just overblown stories that we can't verify. So a lot of the sort of delay, I suppose, in understanding what's going on comes from this desire to verify, you heard someone say this in the Warsaw Ghetto, but how do we know that's true? And so then there's this sort of bureaucratic inertia of trying to verify it. The answer, of course, is that, and I'm talking here predominantly of the British and American governments, they knew quite a bit, and arguably quite early on, certainly early enough on for it to provide a pretty substantial foundation for any decision in 1944 about bombing Auschwitz. And so one of the first things is the British. The British are, because of their code breaking abilities at Bletchley Park, they've been reading German police codes on the Eastern Front for almost as early as the invasion began in Russia. And so they are quite aware of the Einsatzgruppen activities of mass murdering Jews in occupied Soviet Union, of the police reports that are being sent back of how many people are being murdered. And they have a very good understanding that this is a thing that is going on. The extent to which they share this with the Americans is a little bit more of a difficult nut to crack. But we have another major event, which comes from a guy named Regner, who gets this from other eyewitnesses, and he sends a telegram to the British, but also to the Americans. And this is known, obviously, as the Regner telegram. And it arrives on the desk of a guy named Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was the president of the American Jewish Congress, an incredibly influential Jewish leader in the United States, someone with access to government. And he gets this in August 1942, and it's actually been delayed by the American government on purpose. But in this document, it lays out that there is this plan to exterminate the Jews of Poland, of Europe, even suggests that prussic acid might be a mode of doing this. He's invited to the State Department, where a high-ranking State Department official said the evidence did confirm, and this is a quote, by the way, confirm and justify your deepest fears. And then in November 25th, details of this telegram are released to the press. I have a telegram here, so I'll just read a bit of it. Have received, this is what he sent to Rabbi Stephen Wise on August 29th, 1942. He says, have received through Foreign Office following message from Regner, Geneva. Received alarming report that in Führer headquarters, plan discussed and under consideration. All Jews in countries occupied or controlled Germany, number 3.5 to 4 million, should, after deportation and concentration in Eastern Europe at one blow, be exterminated to resolve once for all Jewish question in Europe. Action reported planned for autumn, methods under discussion, including prussic acid. We transmit information with all necessary reservation as exactitude cannot be confirmed. Informant stated to have close connections with highest-ranking German authorities and his reports generally reliable. Informant Consultant Network, Foreign Office, has no information bearing on or confirming story. And the guy that they get the information from is a German on the ground in the vicinity of Auschwitz. It's a very clear message, and it results in a thing known as the Eden Declaration, after Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, which comes out on 17 December 1942, which includes the words, quote, from all the occupied countries, Jews are being transported in conditions of appalling horror and brutality to Eastern Europe. None of those taken away are ever heard of again. The able-bodied are slowly worked to death in labor camps. The infirm are left to die of exposure and starvation, or are deliberately massacred in mass executions, end quote. Oh, and that's 1942, end of 1942. So the governments know quite a bit. The populations know quite a bit. Sometimes Jewish populations know even more. And it's important to lay out, again, that by 1944, the Allies knew about Auschwitz as well. We'll talk a little bit in more detail about the photographs that everyone's probably seen, because they're a bit misleading. But they know that Auschwitz exists, and they know that it's one of these places where this is taking place. It's also important to note that within the American government, there are sort of agencies that are not working together. So, for example, the American State Department is quite anti-Semitic in lots of ways, quite unwilling to really take any particularly proactive steps to do anything about the Holocaust, and arguably about the Nazi discrimination against Jews going all the way back to 1933 with regards to immigration policies. The Treasury Department, on the other hand, is actually quite proactive in many ways, as trying to do what it can. And there's a great book by the scholar Becky Erbleding about the War Refugee Board and its attempts to actually rescue people, right? And so even within the American government, you sort of have departments that are at cross purposes. And we can talk perhaps a little bit later on about FDR, and his position, because one of the things that I think it also is important to bear in mind is the very nature of anti-Semitism in the United States is a sort of complicating factor for prominent Jewish officials and Jewish leaders who want to bring attention to the Holocaust or to the government of the Holocaust, right? Because they're very sensitive to the accusation by American anti-Semites that sort of Jews are controlling the government or are trying to get the U.S. involved in World War II for their own purposes, et cetera, et cetera. And so in some ways, they're trying to walk this tightrope of actually, yes, wanting to use the influence they do have to prevent the Holocaust, while also not sort of confirming these anti-Semitic stereotypes that they are exercising sort of undue influence on the government. So they're in kind of a difficult situation. But the short answer is that quite a bit is understood at the government level and in the sort of secret communities level about what's going on.
Is there sort of conflicts within government that you've referred to in the American situation? Are those sort of similar conflicts reflected in Britain as well, or are the different arguments or different debates going on altogether over here? I
mean, I'm less, to be very clear, I'm less familiar with sort of the ins and outs of the British system. There is a very, very concerted effort in Bletchley Park. There's an entire sort of section whose sole job it is to sort of monitor these kinds of things. They're creating reports. They're sending them up. The extent to which they're actually accomplishing a lot is debatable. We know, for example, that Churchill was very, very careful to not do anything that might possibly jeopardize the fact that the British were cracking these codes, i.e. not to tip the hand. And this often, with regards to the Holocaust, it meant that they didn't disclose things that they had gotten from cracking those codes, certainly publicly, and they were less willing to do that, I think, in general. From what I understand, they've also, and we'll talk about this later, their argument about the best way to rescue Jews and end the Holocaust is essentially the same as the Americans, which is win the war, destroy Nazism, destroy the Third Reich, and that's the best way to help people that are being oppressed by the Nazis.
I just want to now touch on, again, one of the issues which we mentioned at the outset, and that is the discussion of the arguments surrounding capabilities and about what air power could and could not achieve at this particular time. Now, we've mentioned summer 1944, but obviously Bomber Command in particular is a very different beast then to Bomber Command back in 1941, where we started this discussion, where Pierce first received the request from the Poles to consider bombing the camp at Auschwitz. Now, we've discussed Bomber Command's failings and the lack of adequate navigational and bomb aiming technology in earlier episodes. And again, Tammy Davis-Biddle touches on this as well. And she notes that in the light of the fact that well under half of Bomber Command's planes were getting into the general vicinity of their targets, it's hard to imagine how 41 raid on such a distant and small target as Auschwitz would have had much chance of success, especially since the rate envisaged one designed to enable the prisoners to escape would have had to be exceptionally precise. She thinks that Portal's reservations were realistic at that time. He was correct to claim that the bomb load that a two-engined Wellington bomber could have carried to such a remote target would have been too small to ensure that in the unlikely event that the crew actually managed to find the target, that the facilities could have been damaged enough to have allowed the prisoners to escape. So while that is certainly true in January 1941, I think the position looked very different in summer and autumn 1944, when obviously the strategic bombing campaign is at its height. But before we consider further the actual technical capabilities of the aircraft, why is that particular period or window considered so important, Waitman, in terms of why was that sort of considered to be the window when something could possibly have been done by the Allies bombing the camps?
Right. So, I mean, so first and foremost, this is as a result of the invasion of Italy. It really brings the aircraft within range, first of all, of Auschwitz. They can actually really do something without it having been sort of a very sort of complex and tenuous kind of mission. But in terms of the Holocaust, it's the period of 1944, summer 1944, is the period of the deportation and murder of Hungarian Jews. Up until this point, the government of Admiral Horthy in Hungary has been a collaborationist government. It's an ally of the Nazis. But they have sort of carried out their own anti-Jewish policies, but they've kept them basically within Hungary. In the places where they've conquered new territory, they've treated those Jews differently. But the Jews of pre-war Hungary have been, they've been oppressed, discriminated against, but they have not been mass murdered in the way that Jews that the Nazis come into contact with when they occupy countries have been. Horthy, by 1944, is reading the writing on the wall, recognizing that, the war is not going well, and that closest neighbor, the Soviet Union, is not going to look positively on that. And his government is kind of wavering. And so he's invited to come talk to Hitler about this. And while he's talking to Hitler, Hitler invades and essentially occupies Hungary and places into power a right-wing government that will do exactly what he wants. And it sends Adolf Eichmann, who are the Nazis' deportation expert. He is sent to Hungary to begin arranging the deportation of Hungarian Jews on the order of 400 plus thousand to Auschwitz to be murdered on arrival. And we know this with lots of different pieces of evidence, but on the ground at Auschwitz, there are some really important preparations that begin in anticipation of this operation. Rudolf Höss, the commandant, is actually sent back to take over again. He'd been basically demoted, but he's sent back because of his expertise. I remember I mentioned at the very beginning, those two little houses that were converted into gas chambers at the very beginning of Auschwitz's usage as an extermination center. One of them is refurbished and put back into operation. The gas chambers that are crematoriums 2, 3, 4, and 5 in Birkenau are refurbished, repaired, ready to go. and the very famous rail line that we all see when we visit Auschwitz that goes directly into the camp and leads down between crematoriums 2 and 3 is created at this time to better facilitate the trains coming from Hungary. And it's really important when we start to talk about what could have been done, in terms of preventing the Holocaust, to really note two, I think, key kind of quantitative views of the Holocaust. One is that much of the Holocaust is already complete by the summer of 1944. At least much of the Holocaust that will be, ended by the war. Had the war gone on, or had the Nazis been successful, we'd be talking about something different. But even, earlier, right? So by the spring of 1942, 1/3 of the Jews that were going to be murdered during the Holocaust had been killed. 1 year later, in the spring of 1943, 2/3 had already been killed. And that's just with the Operation Reinhard camp. So Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, and then a little bit of Auschwitz and Chelmno, right? So mass numbers. And that's also not including the 2 million who had already been murdered with the Holocaust by bullets, being shot on the Eastern Front and in ghetto clearances, right? So the bulk of the victims had already been murdered. And even in the context of the Hungarian transports, the transports begin on April 29th, 1944, Auschwitz from Hungary. And by the end of June, in just 2 months, 381,661 Jews from Hungary had already been deported. Most of them have been murdered. So, the speed, the tempo with which it takes place is incredibly rapid. But this is the context of the autumn and summer of 1944, when, the Allies are being increasingly pressured in some circles to do something to bomb the camps.
We're just talking about the latter part of 1944, end of summer into autumn. You have the Allies dropping supplies to the Polish Home Army during the Warsaw Uprising. Is it just a case of lack of political will, or myriad competing priorities in the summer of 44? Is it a case of just trying to bring the war in Europe to an end as soon as possible?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, because one of the questions, getting back to your original one, is a question of sort of feasibility. And it's worth noting here at the beginning of that conversation that, many of your listeners have probably seen the aerial photographs of Auschwitz to Birkenau that were taken by a mosquito bomber, right? They're very clear. They're great sort of aids of knowing what was going on there. And they're labeled, right? It says crematorium 1, crematorium 2, crematorium 3, crematorium 4. It says, trains. It says people going to the gas chambers, right? It's all labeled very clearly, very nicely. That image is deeply misleading, because those annotations were added in 1978 by 2 CIA photo analysts who had gone back and found these photos, and then said, "Oh, what are we looking at?" Right? So oftentimes in the context of this discussion, people trot out those images and sort of say, "See,
yeah,
they knew exactly what was going on. How could they possibly not take action?" Whereas the truth is probably more that, they were certainly not clear, at least not that clear, of like what parts of the camp were what and what was happening there, right? It was much less clear in terms of targeting what was going on. And then getting to the discussion of why did they say no? I mean, I think we should probably maybe come back to that in a second. I guess the feasibility is the next one, right? Was this possible with the technology at the time? And I think the reasonable consensus, again, I'm not an air power historian by any stretch, but I don't think you have to be. I mean, the reasonable consensus is, look, the Allies aren't able anywhere else in Europe to really conduct precision bombing at the scale of a building, right? Yeah. I mean, this is just not something that they're able to do. You could do it with like a ground attack aircraft, like a P-51 or whatever, like one of those, a Stuka kind of thing, but you can't do it with strategic bombing. And those aircraft don't have the range to get there, right? So we're already facing a precision problem. The second piece of it is that, one argument, there's sort of two sub-arguments in the bombing Auschwitz. One is bombing the rail lines to Auschwitz to prevent the trains from getting there. And the second is bomb Auschwitz itself to destroy the gas chambers and prevent them from gassing people. And with regards to the first one, I think, again, the experience of the war elsewhere shows that railroad tracks really aren't that hard to repair. Once they're bombed out, it's not that difficult to just throw some more ballast in to build the embankment back up and put rail lines in. So, that's probably not going to solve the problem unless you make it kind of a repetitive, continuous operation like the bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail or something, which is, again, definitely not something that the Allies are going to sign up for, based on their viewpoint that the best way to end Nazi mass crimes is to end the Nazis. And again, with regards to bombing the camp itself, the ability is just not there to really, bomb a building or 4 buildings. And the gas chambers in Birkenau are not dispersed in any way from the rest of the prisoner population. So you would basically carpet bomb Birkenau, and probably if you were able to hit the gas chambers, you would probably also kill, thousands and thousands and thousands of prisoners. Now, to be clear, we also know from prisoners that many of them had already made this calculation and were okay with that, because they'd already considered themselves to be dead anyway, just sort of walking dead in Auschwitz. And they would have been quite happy to see, to die themselves if they knew that it was killing Nazis and blowing up the gas chambers. Of course, there are other people that are arguing against that. And there are Jewish community leaders that are also, don't want that to happen either. So there's lots of sort of layers of calculations to be made here. And then you have the Allied, essentially the Allied policy, which is we're not going to divert war and operational equipment to something like this, because we think the best way to stop the Nazis is to stop the Third Reich from existing and winning the war. Now, all that being said, there's also, I think, a not negligible amount of anti-Semitism certainly in the American government, and possibly, amongst some of the decision makers at various levels, that also make them less interested in doing this. So I think it's fair to say, on kind of an empirical level, that bombing Auschwitz was a losing proposition. You're not going to stop the Holocaust. You're probably not going to rescue any people. Even if there was a mass escape, they end up in rural Poland, which is not a particularly hospitable place for Jews either. And in the end, most of the Holocaust, the horse had left the barn. Most of the Holocaust had already taken place by this point. However, and this is the big however that I put in, this is Waitman's opinion. It may not be, dogma, but my sense is that's still not a good reason not to do it. At the very least, you could have done it to try and to show that you at least cared enough as a government to try to do something about it, right? I mean, they do bomb Monowitz, right, which is not very far away, and it's a factory, right? One of the main efforts at Buna was to create synthetic rubber, which actually makes it quite an important sort of war industry target, and so they do bomb it. And I have to think that diverting a couple raids or 10, 20 bombers to try to bomb Auschwitz-Birkenau in summer 1944, where the skies are relatively, I would imagine, relatively safe, certainly over Poland, for strategic bombing. I think there is a moral failing there, and that may be me editorializing a bit, but I think that was a mistake, because it was worth a try, and who knows what might have happened, which is a long answer to your question. But I mean, I think there's a lot involved here, and of course, I'll just end that question or that answer by saying that, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is a litmus test for people, about how they feel about the larger failure of the Allies to rescue Jews and prevent the Holocaust. So that people will often focus on this and sort of and rivet count and how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And then neglecting the fact that the Allies had a magnificent chance to at least prevent a large number of Holocaust victims from being murdered between 1933 and 1939. And instead, they limited immigration quotas. They did everything possible to prevent Jews from emigrating into their countries, into places of safety. And that's the sort of, could we have stopped the Holocaust? That's, I think, the more fruitful discussion.
I'd just like to read this quote again. It's from Biddle, which I think sort of summarizes some of the discussion that we've just had there. And she says that the history of both the interwar period and World War II is full of examples of a deaf ear being turned to the Jews. Wrenching evidence of insensitivity and prejudice can be found in the documents, and they are jarring, painful, and infuriating to the historian who reads them. Few scholars who examine the many heartfelt pleas for Allied help regarding Auschwitz can fail to be moved by them, and they are all the more powerful because of the conscientious and thoughtful way in which they were put forward. I think that's a really good sort of summary of the position that you just outlined, Waitman.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that is sort of most, in some ways, really agonizing to read are people, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who know about the Holocaust, whether it's from Kurt Gerstein, whether it's from, the Vatican, whether it's from personal experience like Verba and Wetzler, or Jan Karski, or Witold Pilecki, people who have been there, done that, seen it, and are trying to convince essentially bureaucrats in Western governments, right, that this is taking place, and having them say, well, I appreciate you bringing this to us, and we just need to kind of verify it. And it just, it falls into the sort of, governmental filing cabinet. And meantime, people continue to die. And it's just, and there are lots of reasons for that. And there are lots of people who are able to sort of hide behind bureaucratic processes, to mask, potentially other reasons why they're not interested. But also it's just sometimes just government being, government and not, acting with decisiveness.
Yeah, because I see people say sometimes about sending, 24 mosquitoes on a raid of it, but they're not thinking about what's happening above that and the governmental discussions and such like. So I think that's a really, really good point.
I mean, but again, it's one of those things that it could have been done. It wouldn't have. It's not like you are sacrificing 3 carrier battle groups to do this. Yeah. I mean, it could have been done, and actually there were some interesting discussions of people proposing ground incursions. There was a guy who was asking the American government to consider essentially, taking volunteers for kind of a crack insertion to try to break into the camp and let prisoners out. So there's actually a lot of discussions going on, and then there's more that has come out since Waitman wrote in 1984 about, from new archives, new things in the government that have been declassified. But from my position, I think it can be sometimes difficult to sort of not to moralize as a scholar. You're looking at what happened and why it happened and trying to see things from the vantage point of the people at the time. But, as a not direct but interesting analog, George Patton sent an entire, mechanized armored task force to go try to rescue his son-in-law from a German captivity, and it got completely rinsed, and it was basically completely lost. And so it makes you wonder, when the motivation is there, what would the Americans have done? In the Philippines, the Americans sent a special, Ranger task force in to try to rescue prisoners from a Japanese prisoner of war camp because they heard that it was going to be executed, right? And so again, everything I've just mentioned as a caveat, which is that, you're not really going to do a lot. Most of the victims are already dead, and chances are you're not going to be successful. I just don't see what the downside was for at least trying.
Yeah. Gosh, there's just a huge amount to take in there, isn't there? It's just so much to absorb. And yeah, it's. I think this is probably one of the most difficult topics that we've discussed really so far. But as I mentioned to James earlier, I think that these topics do have to be debated, and we shouldn't try and avoid them and skirt around them. They do have to be talked about.
There's an interesting thing too with that you bring that up because that you have a podcast dedicated to bomber command and to air power, and one of the things that Auschwitz is sort of represents is that air power isn't everything, and it can't do everything. And it has limitations, and unfortunately, it's not it's not the magic bullet in some instances. This is one of them. And so it's one of those situations where even had everyone involved been like, absolutely, let's do this, let's devote all of our resources to it, they probably would have been effective in making Birkenau a complete crater, like a smoking crater, but they probably would have killed everybody in it. And so is that really so?
I think one of the things that we have tried to do from the very outset is to sort of point out the limitations of air power and how Bomber Command and the strategic bombing campaign did not, from very early on in the campaign, sort of live up to its pre-war billing, if you like, and how its limitations very quickly became evident. I think it's really, really important that we do point that out, and we do debate that right throughout the whole course of the war. We talked in an episode a couple of weeks ago, didn't we, about did Bomber Command succeed?
Yeah.
I think the answer was, well, partially, but only very, very partially. So yeah, there's just so much to think about there. Is there anything else you want to add, James, before we wind things up?
Nothing from me, no.
All right, okay. Waitman, any other points that you want to make before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, I just appreciate having me on, and I think, again, because as I'm going to beat this drum, because I beat it, we have Ways Fest all the time and everywhere else, the Holocaust and Nazi genocidal policy is part of the war. It cannot be divorced from it, right? It is, it's incredibly and inextricably intertwined with it. And this is just another example of that, that even in something sort of as, and again, I know this isn't true, but something as sort of technological and sterile and precise as aerial bombing is not divorced from Holocaust. It is and relevant to that conflict.
Yeah. All of these different threads just cannot be separated, can they? That's the thing. I think there's such a tendency by historians, but also by the public, to sort of view different aspects of the war as sort of different separate topics, if you like. So the Battle of the Atlantic or the Eastern Front or whatever. And you can't divorce all of these things. They are all part and parcel of the same thing, and they cannot be viewed in isolation.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we'll draw a line there then, Waitman. So thank you so much for coming on to the podcast this evening. That was a really, really interesting and, as I said, very, very difficult discussion. But we really do appreciate your views, and I'm sure that our listeners will find that a very thought-provoking debate.
Definitely. Lots to think about. And Yes. Just essentially the usual. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I just realised I didn't mention the Bristol Blenheim this week. So that's one thing to raise anyway. But do please leave us a review or... Yeah. Oh, no, well, technically I've mentioned it now, so there we go. So, but as ever, do please leave us a review or a star rating wherever you get your podcasts. For early access to episodes and live streams, Q&A sessions, please consider becoming a subscriber for as little as £2.40 a month. The link is in the show notes, or you can visit nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. Please also feel free to join our Facebook discussion group, which is open to all listeners, and follow us on our various social media platforms.
Thank you again, Waitman, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you very much. Bye.